starting a riot over dancing. This is like a racist version of Footloose. Hello and welcome. I'm Ashley and this is Beauty Biography. Every Friday, we explore the life of an iconic beauty from childhood through their career, their loves, their loss. We cover it all while creating an inspired makeup look. Today we are discussing the actress that film historian Donald Bogle would often compare to Jackie Robinson, and with great cause. She blazed a trail, she opened doors, and she laid down footsteps that many would follow in. She became the first African American to be nominated in a leading role for an Academy Award, and this trail that she blazed would come at an incredibly high cost, ultimately that of her own life. Let's talk about Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy was born Dorothy Jean Dandridge on November 9th, 1922 in Cleveland, Ohio. Dorothy was a Scorpio, and if this is not your first time here, well then you know, I love me a Scorpio. My dad's a Scorpio, I'm a Cancer myself. I get Scorpios. Scorpios tend to have, we always say it, a soft inside, and they can sometimes have a shell, an outer shell that kind of protects them. This can look a few different ways, but for Dorothy, it's going to look like a very calm, even gentle demeanor on the outside that can sometimes hide trauma that she had experienced and that was, really eating her up on the inside. Scorpios also tend to be very loyal people, and Dorothy was nothing if not loyal. We're going to see through her life, she was often loyal to, I think, some people that didn't necessarily deserve loyalty. Speaking of which, let's talk about Dorothy's parents. So Dorothy's mother, Ruby, was married to a man named Cyril Dandridge. And a few months before Dorothy was born, Ruby leaves Cyril and takes with her Dorothy's younger sister, Vivian. By most accounts, the relationship between Ruby and Cyril was a bit of like an oil and water type of deal. Ruby was very outgoing, had a very kind of like domineering, demanding personality, and Cyril was very soft-spoken. He was a cabinet maker and a pastor. He was just a very soft-spoken, gentle, timid, and introverted man. Ruby and Cyril, they got married, they had their daughter Vivian, and they lived with Cyril's mother. They lived in a nice, quiet, clean suburb that was only for Black people, because obviously this is the 20s, so we have segregation pretty much across the entirety of the United States of America. So they live in this Black suburb of Cleveland with Cyril's mother, and Ruby really resents Cyril's mother and begins to resent Cyril because she thinks he is too submissive to his mother. So when she's about 5 months pregnant with Dorothy, she leaves Cyril. So upon leaving Cyril, pregnant Ruby moves to a quite poor neighborhood with Vivian because that's all she can afford. And after Dorothy is born in November of 1922, Ruby and the girls move around quite a bit for the next couple years because Ruby is trying to evade Cyril. Cyril is actively looking for Ruby and his two daughters. He wants to be with his two daughters. He wants them in his life. He wants to see them. And Ruby is determined to keep them away from him for no other reason that anyone can tell than she just was not necessarily the nicest person. That's the best way to put it. We know this because Ruby would tell Dorothy and Dorothy's sister Vivian horrible things about Cyril. She would say, he doesn't want you, he doesn't want me, he kicked us out, he never wants to see you, he doesn't love you, he doesn't want you. She would say all these terrible things that were not true because Cyril was actively looking for his daughters. He did want them in his life, and he did not kick Ruby out. He had begged Ruby to stay. He wanted her to stay and he wanted to live a life with his daughters, and Ruby just, again, really not a nice person. All the lies that Ruby told Dorothy about her father were very damaging to Dorothy, and she would not find out the truth until much later in her life, at which point she would really regret never getting to know her father. Quite sadly, though, this is only the beginning of the problems in Dorothy's childhood. When Dorothy is just a wee little thing, Ruby gets work as a maid, and she meets a woman named Geneva Williams and begins a romantic relationship with her. Geneva moves in with Ruby, Dorothy, and Vivian, and while Ruby goes to work, she leaves Geneva in charge of tending to the household and watching Ruby and Vivian. Ruby wanted the girls to be in show business, and so Geneva would train them and take them to lessons daily for dancing, singing, acrobatics. She would have them practice their routines and make them practice like constantly. And if, she didn't think they were doing a good enough job, or she didn't like something, or they were, trying to be kids and play around, because they're very small children. We're talking under 5 years old at this point. These are like a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. So if she didn't like something they were doing, Geneva would punish them very harshly. They would get terrible spankings all the time. It was just awful. And pretty much everyone agrees that Ruby at this point just kind of was like, okay, now it's Ruby's business now, or Geneva's business now. Like, Ruby is at work, and however Geneva wanted to run the household, however she wanted to discipline Vivian and Dorothy, Ruby was like, not my problem. She was not really concerned with it, which is awful, because I'll tell you what, if someone lays their hand on my child, they're not going to have a hand to lay on anyone the next time. So Dorothy and Vivian have been being basically trained by Ruby and Geneva to have this act, and they titled the act The Wonder Children. It's this little act where Dorothy and Vivian, they sing, they dance. It's very entertaining, enough so that they begin a tour of the southern United States. They go on this tour and they are singing and dancing and making all these appearances almost nonstop for around 5 years. They don't go to school. They're literally just working pretty much nonstop, and their appearances are paying the bills for the entire family. Once the stock market crashed and the Great Depression hit, the work kind of dried up. They can no longer get money on tour because people don't have that disposable income to pay to go to one of their shows. So the work dries up, they go back to Cleveland, and around this time, Hollywood releases the first all-black lead film, which was called Heart of Dixie. Ruby notices this and thinks, okay, this is a door opening. There's going to be a lot of work in Hollywood for Black actors and actresses. So Ruby decides we're all going to move to Hollywood. Ruby, Geneva, Dorothy, and Vivian all pack up and move to Hollywood. And when they get there, Ruby begins working at radio stations. She is an extra in films, and she also continues to do maid work. And finally, the girls are allowed to go to school. So they start going to McKinley Junior High, and while there, they meet a classmate named Etta James. In 1934, they decide to change their act from the Wonder Children to the Dandridge Sisters, and Etta joins their duo, so they become a trio. The trio begins appearing in films like The Big Broadcast of 1936, A Day at the Races, and It Can't Last Forever. These appearances are small, but the Dandridge Sisters are also booking high-profile nightclubs like the Cotton Club and the Apollo Theater, so they become very well known. Dorothy is the standout in the group. With her beauty and her bright eyes, she is like the star. She is the Diana Ross. She is the Beyonce. She is the original breakout star of a girl group, to be honest. It's funny how many times history repeats itself. This was, the Dandridge Sisters with Dorothy being the breakout. That's like the first Diana Ross. And we see it with the Supremes, and then we'll again see it with Destiny's Child and Beyonce. So Dorothy really does blaze a trail in so many ways. While the trio is performing at the Cotton Club in New York City, Dorothy meets a dancing duo named the Nicholas Brothers, and she falls in love with one half of that duo, Harold Nicholas. Dorothy doesn't have much time for romance at this moment, though, because shortly after their appearance at the Cotton Club, the Dandridge sisters set sail on an ocean liner across the Atlantic for a series of performances at the Palladium in London. They knocked their performance at the Palladium out of the park, but around this time, Dorothy is having a lot of stage fright. She had always had anxiety around performing, I'm sure in large part because Geneva was a monster who would punish them if she felt they did anything wrong. Speaking of Geneva, Dorothy is very fed up with Geneva at this point too. Geneva had always been quite physically abusive of the girls, just really terrible to them. But at this point, Dorothy is becoming a woman, obviously. She's filling out, and Geneva is making Dorothy tape down her breasts so that it appears that she is flat-chested, and Geneva becomes obsessed with Dorothy's virginity. This abuse climaxes when Geneva decides that she is going to inspect Dorothy to make sure that she is still a virgin. This is assault. It's not okay. It's completely screwed up. And after this incident, Dorothy actually punches Geneva, which I say, you know what? It's about time. And I understand that violence is not the answer, but I do think that some people sometimes, I can understand why they get punched in the mouth. That's all I'm going to say. She deserved to be punched in the mouth. After this incident, Dorothy decides that she's going to leave the Dandridge sisters. She does not want Geneva to be her manager anymore. She needs a little bit of distance, and she can't completely cut Geneva out of her life because that is still her mother's life partner. But she doesn't want to have to work with her every day. And so she makes the decision that she's leaving the group, and she is not only going to be a singer, but she wants to go into acting. In 1940, Dorothy wins a role in a theater production called Meet the People. This is a very successful play, and this is a huge barrier that Dorothy breaks down because the play was basically all white except for Dorothy. But Dorothy, she didn't let that stop her from auditioning. She saw no reason why the character she was playing could not be played by a Black woman, and she goes in, she auditions for this part that was traditionally, you know, it's not that the part was written in any way that would require it or even make sense if it were specifically a white woman. It's just it had always been played by a white woman. Dorothy doesn't see why it can't be played by a Black woman, so she goes in, auditions without even thinking twice about it, and she gets the role. So this is a very forward-thinking move on Dorothy's part. Later that year, Dorothy gets her first credited film role in the movie For Shall Die. She follows this up with small roles in Lady from Louisiana with John Wayne and Sundown with Gene Tierney. By 1941, Dorothy is engaged to Harold Nicholas of the Nicholas Brothers, and the Nicholas Brothers are set to appear later that year in the big budget musical Sun Valley Serenade. They are supposed to be doing a number called Chattanooga Choo Choo, and Harold thinks, you know what, Dorothy would be a fantastic addition to our number. So he talks to the film execs and says, hey, my fiance would be amazing in this. I think she would really elevate the number. Can she be in our performance? The studio ends up agreeing, and this is a really big break for Dorothy. This appearance gets her noticed, and she will go on to star in a series of soundies. Soundies were these short musical films that would appear on jukeboxes that had little screens. The soundies would place a big emphasis not only on Dorothy's singing and acting and dancing abilities, but also on her beauty and her physical appeal. On September 6th, 1942, right before she turns 20 years old, Dorothy marries Harold Nicholas. Their wedding was attended by the first African-American woman to win an Academy Award, Hattie McDaniel. The year that Dorothy and Harold marry, Dorothy appears in the films Hit Parade and Drums of the Congo, but Dorothy is much more interested in being a wife and a mother. Her best friend Geraldine, who is also Harold's sister, so Harold's sister, Dorothy's sister-in-law, becomes Dorothy's very best friend, and they will remain friends for the rest of Dorothy's life. So Geraldine says that Dorothy, she was very focused on becoming a mom. She would have been completely happy to give up a career forever and just be a wife and a mother. That was a dream for her. And this makes so much sense to me, you guys, because I, in my own personal life, know several people who had very traumatic childhoods, and I'm not saying that this always happens, but it's not surprising to see people who have traumatic childhoods really aspire to have a steady family of their own one day, because they didn't have that supportive, steady, peaceful family life growing up, and they kind of want to create that. So this is something that really struck a chord to me, where I could kind of see where Dorothy was coming from, and that she didn't have this picture perfect childhood, and it's almost like she wanted to create that family that she never got to have, because hers was very broken, and there were a lot of really terrible things about her childhood, and she wanted to have a child and give a child a better life. So when Dorothy finds out in early 1943 that she's pregnant, she is ecstatic. Fast forward 9 months later to September of that year, and Dorothy begins having labor pains one day. She is just in a lot of pain, but her husband Harold thinks, oh no, you're still not due for like another week or so. It's going to be fine. And he drops her off at Geraldine's house and goes to play golf. Great move, Harold. The pains keep getting worse, and Geraldine starts begging Dorothy, like, let's go to the hospital. We have to go to the hospital. Let's find somebody that can take us, because they don't have a car there. And Dorothy's like, no, I'm waiting for Harold. I don't want to go to the hospital without Harold. Geraldine is getting really nervous. She, keeps trying to keep Dorothy relaxed and trying to make her comfortable, but she's really concerned and really, really wants them to go to the hospital. Finally, Dorothy relents and says, okay, let's go to the hospital. So they have to go find a neighbor to let them borrow their car so that they can even get to the hospital. And when they get there, Dorothy is in really advanced labor. Like, she really probably should have already started pushing, but she was holding out. She was waiting. She wanted Harold to go with her. It's her first time having a child. I only have one child. I don't know if birth gets easier the next time. I don't know if I'll ever find out, but I can tell you, if I would have been by myself, I can't imagine the anxiety. When I went to the hospital with my daughter, I got sent home twice, and I was a complete nervous wreck. I can't imagine having to do that without your husband. That's just awful. And shame on Harold. So during delivery, the doctor ends up needing to use forceps in the delivery. The baby is born a girl. She's a little girl, and her name is Carolyn Suzanne Nicholas. Dorothy is in love, and so is Harold. The birth of their daughter brings a period of bliss to their marriage. It had been a difficult period of time for them. Harold was a little bit of a womanizer. He was always playing golf, but this brings some peace and some domestic bliss to the family, if only for a short time. This bliss does not last as long as the couple would have hoped, because by the time Carolyn is 2 years old, the family can tell something is off developmentally. Carolyn is not able to recognize faces. She cannot recognize that Dorothy is her mother. She is not vocalizing. She's not able to form words, and she's just not where she's supposed to be developmentally at this point. This is heartbreaking. My daughter is 18 months old, and I have to tell you, like, her calling me mama and recognizing me is like the highlight of my life. And the first little bit of having a baby, if you've never had one, I have to tell you this, like, the first months are so difficult, because you're giving like everything to this little human being, and they can't really express affection back. And so it's a little bit of a thankless job up until the point that they can express affection towards you, and they recognize you, and you get that joy and that reciprocation back. So not being able to experience that, I can't imagine the toll that this took on Dorothy. To make matters worse, Harold withdraws because he does not know how to cope with this. He doesn't know. He's scared. He almost doesn't even want to know what's wrong. He leaves Dorothy alone for days at a time to take Carolyn to these doctor's appointments and these specialist appointments where they're trying to understand what is going on. And Dorothy is really kind of just left on her own to deal with this. And it is a tremendous burden. I cannot imagine how that just ripped at her heart. So she takes Carolyn to all these doctors, and eventually the doctors tell her that Carolyn has suffered permanent brain damage that was likely a result of a birth injury, probably because of the forceps. This devastates Dorothy because now not only does she know that, okay, this is not going to get much better for Carolyn, this is not going to get much better for her child, she is now blaming herself. She thinks it's her fault for not getting to the hospital sooner, which there's honestly no way to tell. There's really not. But Dorothy, listen, moms know a lot about guilt. So Dorothy internalizes this guilt. She thinks it's her own fault, which, why is it not Harold's fault? He's the one that went golfing. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not anyone's fault. It's not anyone's fault. These things happen, and there's absolutely no way to Monday morning quarterback life. You just can't do it. Nonetheless, Dorothy has a difficult time coping. She begins relying on prescription drugs, mainly sedatives, to cope with this, and her close friends say that Dorothy never really accepted this. She accepted it intellectually, they said. Like, she understood, okay, Carolyn suffered a birth injury and she's going to be developmentally delayed for the rest of her life. But emotionally, she never came to terms with it. It was definitely a grieving process. You know, there's 5 stages of grief. She never was able to get to acceptance. Dorothy's dependency on prescription drugs only gets worse, and at one point she overdoses and has to be taken to the hospital to have her stomach pumped. Dorothy denies to her friends that this was a suicide attempt. She says it's just an accident, she was being careless. However, this actually becomes a pattern in Dorothy's life of her being found unresponsive and having to be, taken somewhere to get the drugs out of her system because she's taking too many of the prescription drugs, taking them along with champagne and things like that. So this is a very difficult period in her life where she's just not coping. By 1948, Harold has completely abandoned Dorothy and Carolyn, and Dorothy files for divorce in September of 1950. With Harold gone, Dorothy is now completely financially responsible for Carolyn. It's extremely expensive to take care of Carolyn because she needs round-the-clock care. So Dorothy has to hire someone to be there while Dorothy's sleeping to take care of Carolyn, and the bills add up very quickly. So Dorothy has to go back to work. In 1948, Dorothy becomes one of the first Black actors at the Actors Laboratory in Hollywood. And one night they're having a benefit for the Actors Lab, as they called it. And she dances with a man who has become her friend, the actor Anthony Quinn. They're at a public benefit. They just dance together. And of course, all the racists of the time are outraged. A powerful columnist for the LA Times named Hedda Harper writes this absolutely filthy column where she says, and I quote, because I want to get her racist words correct, "Every man in the world is as good as he is in his heart, regardless of race, but that doesn't mean they have to intermix. That's the sort of thing that leads to race riots." Ma'am, who is starting a riot over dancing? This is like a racist version of Footloose. Hedda is not the only columnist who wakes up and chooses racism that day, and so Dorothy decides, okay, I have to respond to this. She does so in a column for the California Eagle, and she rebuts their racist rhetoric with such style and grace and class, and she becomes just lauded by the Black performers in Hollywood, the civil rights activists. She becomes a symbol of Black dignity in Hollywood overnight because she has stood up to these racists and said, you know what, no. It's the late 1940s, and Hollywood is finally beginning to acknowledge that racism is an issue within their community, something that they are still grappling with almost 80 years later, but anyway, I guess it's a very long journey. So there are more roles opening up for Black actors at this time, but the roles are still far and few between. Dorothy refuses to play Black roles that she finds demeaning, so this limits the roles available to her even further. Dorothy decides to return to the nightclub circuit because she really needs to be making money, and she knows this formula, she knows people in that world, and she knows that she can really hit the ground running. So she begins singing in this spectacular act at the Macombo nightclub in West Hollywood. Her act is curated by a pianist named Phil Moore. He helps her curate her act and her new style, and he basically styles her from this fresh-faced beauty to a chanteuse. Dorothy and Phil begin a romantic relationship, and this is a very positive relationship for Dorothy. It is one of the few relationships in her life that's going to be mainly positive. She's also thriving professionally. Her new look and her new act turn over a new leaf in her career. She makes successful appearances at nightclubs in London, New York City. She's having a lot of success, and she's able to support herself and Harold. Unfortunately, Dorothy's stage fright makes a reappearance at this time, which I'm sure a lot of this is trauma coming back. I'm not a psychiatrist. I can't say she had PTSD or anything like that, but I'm sure that being in these settings that were very familiar to her, that she associated with Geneva and that abuse, really brings back bad memories for her. So Dorothy decides that she wants to stop live performances again and focus on acting because it's just too difficult for her to separate live performances from the traumatic childhood and time with Geneva. So Dorothy accepts a role as an African queen in the movie Tarzan's Peril opposite Lex Barker and Virginia Huston. The Motion Picture Production Code, which is basically the board of censors in Hollywood, they voice objections to the film's blunt sexuality. And because of this, people start paying attention to the film. They're like, oh, tell me more. Really? It's bluntly sexual? That sounds interesting. So it kind of backfires on the censorship board because they're thinking, oh, let's object to this movie. But what it actually does is just make people more interested in the movie and in Dorothy. Around this time, it becomes really apparent to Hollywood talent agencies that Dorothy has appeal. She has crossover appeal, meaning that they think she can appeal to not only Black audiences, but white audiences. So MCA, one of the biggest talent agencies in Hollywood, they signed Dorothy. They book her on a series of successful television gigs, including Ed Sullivan's Toast of the Town, and they also set her up on another stint of live shows, but this time in Las Vegas as a headliner. So in 1953, they have her headlining at the Last Frontier in Las Vegas. While she's performing at a headliner there, though, she's not allowed to stay at the hotel initially because, ding, 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 segregation. Las Vegas is still segregated at this time. So the Black performers are not supposed to stay in the hotels that they perform at as guests. They're not allowed to use the public elevators. They're supposed to use like the freight elevators. Dorothy's like, no, if I'm performing here, I should be allowed to stay here, which is 100% correct. So the hotel makes an exception. They allow Dorothy to stay at the hotel as a guest. She used the public elevators, but the pool becomes a sticking point. And there are a couple different versions of this story. I'm going to go with the one that I've heard most often, and that is Dorothy goes to the pool, to the swimming pool. She dips her toe in the water, and after that, the hotel decides, okay, we have to drain the pool. We cannot let white people swim in this pool now. We have to drain it. The entire pool. Like I said, there are some different accounts of this. Some people say that she swam in the pool completely and then they drained it. Some people say that she asked to swim in the pool, and rather than letting her swim in the pool, they decided to drain the pool instead. The significance remains the same. It was racist, it was stupid, and they didn't want a Black woman in their pool and then white people getting in the pool after her. So that's just nonsense. But it's a really significant moment that perseveres to this day in pop culture because they were willing to be entertained by Dorothy, but they weren't willing to let her be equal. And that is a big thing here. The significance of this, again, is still recognized to this day. If you've ever seen Beyonce's Formation video, the scene, the part of the music video where she and her dancers are dancing in an empty pool is a nod to this particular incident with Dorothy Dandridge. So that same year, 1953, 20th Century Fox begins a nationwide talent search to cast an all-black film adaptation of Oscar Hammerstein's musical Carmen Jones. Carmen Jones was a Broadway adaptation of the opera Carmen, but it was set in the World War II era. The film is going to be directed by Otto Preminger, and Otto Preminger watches Dorothy in the film Bright Road. It was a film she had done a year prior. He sees that movie in which Dorothy plays a very demure first grade teacher, and there were several people suggesting Dorothy for the role of Carmen, but after seeing this demure performance, Otto's like, yeah, she's too timid for this. She's not going to work for Carmen. Carmen is very earthy, very sensual. I don't think Dorothy will work for this, which really annoys Dorothy because she kind of had to dress down for the role in Bright Road. She had to dress herself down. She had to make herself, very meek for that role. And so she felt like, why am I being punished for, performing well? Because that's what that performance asked of her, was for her to be a demure first grade teacher. So she didn't feel like she should be punished for playing the role well. Dorothy is determined. She wants to play Carmen and Carmen Jones. So she goes to Max Factor and she has the makeup artist there help her curate a very earthy, sensual, darker look, a look that will evoke the role of Carmen. They help her out, they give her this new look, and she goes to a meeting with Otto Preminger in this new style, and he immediately changes his mind. He's like, she is Carmen, so she gets the role. Dorothy stars opposite Harry Belafonte in the film Carmen Jones. The film opens to great reviews, and it is a huge box office success. After the release of the film on November 1st, 1954, Dorothy becomes the first Black woman to be featured on the cover of Life magazine. The movie is already a US hit, and it goes on to become a global hit, and Dorothy gets an Academy Award nomination for Best Leading Actress. This makes her the first Black actor to get an Academy Award nomination for a leading role. The 27th Academy Awards are held on March 30th, 1955, and although Grace Kelly goes on to grab the top prize for her role in The Country Girl, Dorothy is a sensation. People are enamored by her. They see her at the awards show, and they're just captivated by this woman who has achieved this incredible historic feat. They actually go on to ask her to present an Academy Award the next year. So she becomes a presenter the next year, which is a big deal at this time. That spring, Dorothy signs a 3-movie deal with 20th Century Fox for $75,000 a film. That is about $750,000 in today's money. So this is a big deal. This is like, she's on her way. She's gonna be huge, right? Only problem, of course, there's a man in the way. And that man is Otto Preminger. Dorothy is having an affair with Otto Preminger. They started an affair while they were filming Carmen. If you recall, he was the director of Carmen Jones. They begin this affair, and 20th Century Fox, Daryl Zanuck, the head of 20th Century Fox, when he signed Dorothy, he had all these ideas in his mind. He's like, you know what? She's going to be the first Black screen icon. He bought the rights to the 1930 film The Blue Angel, hoping to remake it with Dorothy in it. He also slates her for smaller roles in The King and I and The Lieutenant Wears Skirts. But Otto says, no, you need to turn him down. You need to tell him no, because from now on, you only take leading roles. Dorothy takes Otto's advice because she trusts him. He's a big deal. He's a big director. She thinks he has her best interests at heart. I don't think she realizes that he's just a very egotistical person, and that's what he's concerned with, rather than what's necessarily best for her career and her circumstances as a woman who needs to work to make money to support her daughter, and a woman who's trying to, make a change in Hollywood and blaze a trail. Otto's kind of more concerned with the ego side of things than anything else. And so he advises her, no, turn down these roles. Dorothy turns down the roles, and two of those roles, the one in The Lieutenant Wore Skirts and in The King and I, end up going to Puerto Rican actress Rita Moreno. Dorothy would definitely go on to regret taking Otto's advice. He had her turn down so many roles that finally the studio just stopped calling her and all of her offers dried up. Dorothy also figures out that Otto is not going to leave his wife for her. Otto was married but separated, and although he was separated, he was not legally divorced, and it becomes clear to Dorothy that he has no intention of actually divorcing his wife to make things honest with Dorothy. By 1957, Dorothy has been absent from film for almost 3 years, and she agrees to play in the film Island in the Sun. The film has an impressive ensemble cast, including Joan Fontaine, Harry Belafonte, and Joan Collins, and the plots include several interracial relationships, which is a very sensitive and controversial topic at this time. If you remember from before, we had the Motion Picture Production Code, the Censorship Board of Hollywood. They are all on top of this. They're like, excuse me, did you say interracial relationships? You're gonna need to show us the script. So the script has to be edited several times to meet the code that the MPCC puts forth. Like they have to, or MPPC, I don't know, it's too long of an acronym. Anyway, the censorship police are there. They're on top of it. Literally, the film police are there, and they make several rewrites to the film. They're like, oh, okay, Dorothy is supposed to kiss a white man. No, we cannot have that. So in the end, Dorothy and her co-star, her white co-star, end up just in a loving embrace because they're not allowed to kiss. Despite the nonsense of the party poopers, the film goes on to be very successful. It's one of the biggest films that year. Dorothy's next film, Tamango, is a French-Italian production. Dorothy agreed to appear in that film because it focused on a 19th century revolt of enslaved persons on a cargo ship. But when Dorothy gets the final script, she sees that there's one scene where she's supposed to be swimming nude, and then for the rest of the film, she's basically in like a two-piece bathing suit the entire time. She sees this and is like, no, 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 no. If it's gonna be that way, I am not gonna be in this film. So the director helps rewrite the script to Dorothy's liking, and because it's a French-Italian film, they don't have to listen to the Hollywood interracial relationship police. As such, Dorothy does share an on-screen kiss with her white co-star. So Dorothy and her co-star share a kiss, and this will be Dorothy's first and only on-screen kiss with a white actor in her entire career. I get that this seems so far removed because it's the 50s, right? Well, I will have you know that I am a huge John Grisham fan. What does that have to do with anything, Ashley? Okay, here's the deal. One of my favorite books, The Pelican Brief, is also one of my favorite movies, also called The Pelican Brief. So that movie came out in the 90s, and it has Julia Roberts and Denzel Washington as the two main characters. In the book, there is a romantic element there, and there is a kiss between these two characters. But in the movie version, they end up taking out that romantic element. I mean, they like maybe hint at it barely, slightly, not even. They make it much more platonic. They remove all of like most of the tension there, and they remove the kiss completely because they were concerned about the optics of a black man and a white woman kissing and what that interracial kiss would mean, and would that alienate some of the audience, and would they, would the film not be as successful? Were they going to upset some people? And that's the 90s. That's in the 90s. So these things are not ancient history. They are very much modern history. In 1958, Dorothy receives an offer from Samuel Golden. He is the G in MGM, so kind of a big deal. He offers her a starring role in the upcoming film Porgy and Bess. Dorothy agrees to take the role, and this causes an instant uproar. Many in the Black community in Hollywood felt that there were they're not wrong. There were some negative stereotypes of Black people in this film. And so a lot of people, a lot of Black performers, and a lot of big voices in the Black community were very upset with Dorothy for taking this role. Dorothy felt really caught between a rock and a hard place at this point. She had not had a starring role in an American film since First, she starred in Carmen Jones. And as Halle Berry put it quite eloquently, Hollywood created this glamorous movie star and then they didn't know what to do with her. There just weren't the films for her. They made this beautiful, wonderful movie star. And then it's like, okay, well, what is she supposed to do? Just she has one role and then she sits at home all day? So we've got a tense atmosphere on set, and it only gets worse when, during the middle of filming, the original director is fired, and he is replaced by none other than Dorothy's scorned lover, Otto Preminger. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Like, the regular non-actor version of this would be like, you walk into work one day, peek your head in your boss's office, and your boss is gone, and it's your ex-boyfriend. Your ex-boyfriend is now your boss. I would quit. I would straight up quit. Otto was known for being a good director, but he was incredibly, incredibly cruel to Dorothy during filming. He would make her redo like take after take after take. He would give her notes that were just really mean. Like if she would do a take, he would give her notes on that take, like constructive criticism, except rather than being constructive, it was just like, oh, you don't have the depth to play this character. You're not good enough to do this, blah, blah, blah. Like he was a total mean person. And he was so hard on Dorothy that it would get to the point that she would forget her lines because she was so anxious over this. And I don't freaking blame her. I don't want anyone telling me anything. I don't want criticism. That's why I could never be an actor. I do not want anyone's notes on what I am doing. I don't want your feedback. I don't want criticism. I'm just kidding. I'm very sensitive to that. And can you imagine, not only are you getting this feedback, but you're getting it in a harsh way from a man who kind of screwed up your career, and you had to leave him because he was a jerk that said he was going to leave his wife for you and he didn't. Like, he's not a nice guy. And this is a very, very just difficult work environment for Dorothy. This is the definition of a toxic work environment. Porgy and Bess had an already long filming schedule, and it ends up being even longer because there's a fire that destroys all the costumes, and they keep rewriting the script. The film goes over budget, and when it's released in June of 1959, it gets mixed reviews, and it is a financial flop. At this point, Dorothy is exhausted by Hollywood. This really just drains her. She's like, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot be in Hollywood anymore. And she sees her ticket out when she starts dating a wealthy hotel owner, Jack Dennison. So she's thinking, all right, I'm just going to settle down with Jack. He'll be able to take care of me and Lynn, and I can finally take a break from show business, because obviously at this point, Dorothy has been in show business her entire life, and she, at every turn, has had people just treating her terribly and traumatizing her. She wants out. I don't blame her. She deserved to be able to get out. She deserves to go marry Jack Dennison and be able to just relax. Dorothy's friends don't feel the same way about Jack. They're like, listen, something's off about him. He seems incredibly mean. He seems very mean-spirited and cruel. Please don't marry him. Something is not right here. Something is not right here. Dorothy does not heed their advice. She marries Jack in June of 1959, and the honeymoon, metaphorically speaking, is over before it even starts, because on the literal honeymoon, Jack reveals to Dorothy that he is actually broke. Dorothy had invested a great deal of money in his hotel, and she finds out, oh, he's completely broke. He's going to lose his hotel. It's going to be foreclosed on. And his only hope, he's thinking, is if Dorothy will perform at his hotel, and that's how they're going to earn money back so that he doesn't lose everything. And if you're thinking this marriage can't get any worse, well, I hate to break it to you, because things can always get worse. So in addition to being a broke liar, Jack is also physically abusive. You've got financial struggles, you've got domestic abuse. Dorothy is sent into a deep depression, and she begins drinking vodka heavily, in addition to the fact that she's still struggling with prescription drugs. Dorothy and Jack have a terrible, terrible marriage, and they finally divorce in 1962. The next year, 1963, Dorothy has to appear in bankruptcy court, and she is mortified when photographers are tipped off that she's there, and they get pictures of her at bankruptcy court, and these are published in newspapers. So basically everyone in Hollywood knows now that Dorothy is in dire financial straits. She owes $150,000 almost in back taxes. She's another $150,000 in debt, money that she lost investing in Jack's hotels, and her home is about to be foreclosed on. Now, Geraldine says if Dorothy would have let her know, they could have done something. Like, she thinks they could have easily prevented the foreclosure. They could have paid off the mortgage. They could have got her up to date on payments or something. But Dorothy doesn't tell Geraldine until right before the foreclosure, and there's just not enough time. So Dorothy's Hollywood home is foreclosed on, and she is forced to move into a rented apartment. But what really devastates her in all this is that she can no longer afford to pay for Harold's round-the-clock nursing care. Harold is 19 years old by this time, and she has the developmental age of a toddler. That is an extremely vulnerable position for a young woman to be in. To be 19 years old and have the development of a toddler, that makes her a very vulnerable person. That makes her someone that could very easily be targeted by abusive people. And so obviously, the fact that Dorothy can no longer afford to have Harold in the home being taken care of around the clock is devastating for her. Dorothy has to make Harold a ward of the state, and Harold is sent to a state mental institution. Dorothy is now completely dependent on alcohol, sedatives, and antidepressants. She had just a few years earlier been this beacon of achievement for the Black community in Hollywood, and now she is financially destitute and separated from her child. Dorothy has secluded herself, and she begins to exhibit some of the signs that would inspire concern that someone may be considering harming themselves. She is making a lot of late night phone calls. That's something we saw in the Marilyn Monroe episode of Beauty Biography. She makes these late night phone calls that are very erratic. She seems hopeful and then hopeless, and just is very back and forth in the same conversation and sometimes incoherent. So her friends begin to get very, very concerned. They have some reason for optimism when Dorothy seems to, a few months later, start to try to pull herself out of this. She gets very determined to overcome this mental health crisis, to begin earning money again so that she can get Harold out of the state mental institution. She begins a strict workout routine. She begins singing and dancing practice every day, and she reconnects with an old friend named Earl Mills and has him help her reboot her career. She's like, I want to make a comeback, please help me. So he does. He helps her get an advance on her autobiography, and she signs a 2-film contract with an independent film production company. So by most appearances, things are looking up by September of 1965. But on the night of September 8th, 1965, Dorothy speaks on the phone with her best friend, Geraldine, and the conversation is very inconsistent. Dorothy oscillates between seeming very hopeful and singing to making cryptic remarks, including, I know that whatever happens, you'll understand. Dorothy abruptly hangs up on Geraldine, and that is the last time that anyone speaks to Dorothy. The next morning, Earl is supposed to pick Dorothy up so that they can go to the airport and fly to New York City for a performance that Dorothy is scheduled to give there. When Earl arrives at Dorothy's house, though, he rings the doorbell and she doesn't answer. He figures out that the door is locked from the inside, so that means Dorothy has to be inside, but she's not answering. He gets very concerned. He breaks open the door with a crowbar. I'm not sure why he had a crowbar on him, but he did. He breaks open the door, and when he gets inside, he finds Dorothy lying dead on the bathroom floor. She was 42 years old. A Los Angeles pathology lab finds that Dorothy has overdosed on her antidepressant. They find that to be the cause of death. However, the Los Angeles County's coroner's office says no, she died from a fat embolism that broke off of a foot fracture that she had sustained a few days earlier. So there's a little bit of dispute here on what actually was the cause of death. For her part, Dorothy's best friend Geraldine believes that Dorothy's death was a combination of accident and Dorothy's will to not live any longer. I think that's probably the best explanation, and it comes from the person who was closest to Dorothy in her adult life. So Anyone that's ever been in the place that Dorothy was, or has ever had someone close to them in that place, I think understands that there's a lot of nuance to that. And I think that the way Geraldine put it was actually very thoughtful. Dorothy had left notes all over her apartment for her loved ones and her friends. She had even left a note to whoever finds me after death, where she expresses her wishes, her final wishes to be cremated and what she wanted done with any money that she might have had laying around. And she actually asked for any money that they find to be left to her mother, Ruby, which her mother really let her down at almost every turn. And she did remain loyal to her, which is a testament to Dorothy. It's so sad to think of her having to leave all these little notes around her apartment to those people that she was going to leave behind. And that's not necessarily indicative of her doing anything, but what it is indicative of is that she was in a state where she felt like there was a possibility that she would harm herself, and she did feel the need to leave something behind to those that were not going with her if something did happen. I understand this. I'll be frank, I've been there. I have written that note, not that exact one, but I have absolutely been in that place of, if I do something to myself, I don't want to leave without saying anything. I want there to be something for those that I'm going to leave behind. And it's a place of great despair and hopelessness and so much pain. Many years later, I can tell you that that is a very temporary, it is a very temporary feeling. That pain does go away. It is temporary. To me now, it's only a distant memory. I'm grateful I made it to the other side, and my heart truly breaks for Dorothy and so many others who don't get to see the other side of that pain. They don't get to make it through that temporary. They never get to see that it's temporary. That is tragic, truly. After a service at Forest Lawn Cemetery, Dorothy was cremated per her wishes. In his biography of Dorothy, the historian Donald Bogle wrote, "She called a lie to the assumption that the movie goddess could only be some fair-haired white beauty. She had proved that Black women could be cast as something other than giggling maids or hefty nurturers without lives of their own." Dorothy Dandridge opened the door for so many. Actress Halle Berry, who coincidentally had been born in the same hospital as Dorothy and also portrayed her in the HBO biopic Introducing Dorothy Dandridge, became the first Black woman to win an Oscar for a leading performance when she won for Monsters Ball in 2002. In her acceptance speech, the first person Halle acknowledged was Dorothy Dandridge. Good luck watching that speech and not crying. I rewatched it last night, and when they pan to Sidney Poitier, I just lose my actual mind. Dorothy opened the door for so many, but that progress came at a very real price for her. It cost her her mental well-being, her health, and her life ultimately. I honestly look forward to the day that progress for any group doesn't have to come at such a high price. People should not have to give up their well-being, their emotional health, their mental health, and their lives for equality. Why does the cost have to be so high? If Dorothy's story moved you, then I invite you to contribute to the charity Therapy for Black Girls. I felt compelled to give back in some way when I was researching this story. It's so hard sometimes to know, how can I help? What can I do? And the answer is just do something. Just do something. Anything positive that you can do in the world, you can make a difference. And it doesn't have to be something huge, but just don't do nothing. Nothing is the only wrong thing to do. So if you felt moved by the story of Dorothy's life, Therapy for Black Girls is a great organization to give to. It helps match Black girls and women with therapists and mental health providers that are good for them, because the truth is, mental health is not always a safe space for Black women and Black girls. Not all therapists are good, and not all therapists know how to help women, Black women, with the specific troubles and struggles that they face today in this world. So I promise you, giving back is something you're never going to regret doing. So if you have the financial ability to, and you feel called to, I will leave the information in the description box below so that you can give. I want to thank you for spending some time with me today. I hope to see you in the next episode of Beauty Biography. We're here every Friday. Make sure you've hit the subscription button so that you will see new episodes pop up in your feed. Let me know in the comments, who would you like to see in next episode? Until then, you take care of yourself. And if you can, try to take care of someone else too, okay? Bye.